Hi there, my name's Vince, I'm a composer, and in this video I'll be taking a little look at the new string library from audio modeling. It's called the SWAM string sections, and I'll be mostly just doing some noodling and some commentary in a fairly unstructured way, but hopefully in the process you'll get a sense of the overall architecture of the instrument, how it sounds in different contexts. The SWAM series is a little bit different from conventional sample libraries in that it uses a principle called physical modeling rather than traditional sampling, which essentially means that rather than being based on recordings of real instruments, it uses a kind of almost more like a synthesis type model to algorithmically create the notes sort of from scratch. And what this means in practice is you have a lot more nuanced control as a performer over the resulting sound. The way that this video is structured is I'll go through each instrument individually, and then in the later part of the video I'm going to start combining some of the different sounds in real time using a software called Divisimate, which allows me to just control multiple legato instruments at the same time just by playing chords on the keyboard. So you'll be able to get a little bit of a sense of how the different instruments sound when combined together. Without further ado, let's get into the video. What you've been listening to is 4 violins only, so very small violin section. The way this works is you have the ability to change the size of the ensemble here up to 6, and then you can start layering patches and changing the divisi number, and that just ensures that the patches won't phase with each other. Here's what it sounds like when you start to sort of stack it up to the highest levels. So I'll set to 6 here, and then I've got another set of 6 here to make our first violins, and then another 6, and then another 6. I'm just going to play all of these together to imitate the sound of a larger ensemble. I'll say right off the bat that I'm not a huge fan of the the sound of the large ensemble, to be honest. It's got a very particular tone to it, and the way that it sounds, especially in faster runs, not sure. You'd expect a lot more divergence between the players, and even with the player's accuracy knob turned right down, it is what it is. So for me, really, I think what this library is for, at least what I can imagine myself using it for, is just taking one divisi section and maybe layering that with some other samples. Because with one divisi section you do hear a lot of that lovely detail. It's a bit like a close mic. I'll just tell you briefly what I'm doing in terms of parameters right now. I'm using a breath controller for dynamics, CC11. I've got bow pressure and bow position here, and then I've also got a tremolo. I will say that this library is particularly good at those repeated notes. You can really hear the bow. What's lovely is that although the sound that's coming out isn't the most realistic in the world, it is very close to what I imagined in my head in terms of the articulation of that phrase, which I think makes it very powerful for writing and sketching. At the same time, I would say it's of limited use for final tracks, in my opinion, just because of the tone. So portamento speed or legato speed is controlled by velocity. It's a little bit unpredictable or hard, at least on this setup. And for whatever reason with these SWAM instruments, it always seems to be very easy to trigger an overly long portamento, which is just very unmusical and wouldn't be useful in 99% of cases, especially between two notes that are quite far apart. Even with the minimum portamento setting in the back end, it still does this kind of really weird long slur. But anyway, so I feel like I have a good amount of control there, despite the occasional misfiring. What I love about SWAM instruments in general is the ability to control vibrato speed as well as vibrato. So it makes a huge difference in terms of creating the right vibe for a particular musical phrase. Sometimes things just need to be really intense. Whereas if I slow the vibrato speed down, it just lacks that intensity. And so being able to play with that as a parameter in real time is really great for coming up with ideas and just for improvising. I should say my background and the context in which I'm coming to this instrument is I work as a composer, I write music day to day, and I work with a lot of string libraries, so I own a lot of the more conventional ones already. And I also am coming at this from the point of view of an improviser, a performer in a past life. I feel like what this instrument is doing, which a lot of other samples aren't able to do, is tapping into that innate musicality and kind of really, I guess, unlocking a lot of that potential. So you can hear, I can be very expressive, and expressive is the kind of buzzword around this instrument. You'll hear a lot of reviewers just say how expressive it is. You might say, well, what's the point of it sounding expressive if it doesn't sound particularly realistic, at least to my ears? And I think, the answer to that is, well, it's really fun, which perhaps is reason enough, enjoy life, have fun. But also I think that means that inevitably, by messing around, you come up with ideas. Again, it's great for writing. And then there are a few things this instrument can do, such as, just this additional level of nuance and real-time performance on things like, say, harmonics, with complete control over bow pressure, bow position, and vibrato speed. You can do things like this. That level of control over a high harmonic note is very hard to come by. Most of the time you're stuck with pre-recorded samples, and either the articulation you want is there or it's not. This is much more like a real instrument. And as such, it requires some time and patience to learn how to get the most out of it. When I click on this button over here, you can see all of the instruments that are currently loaded, and you have this sort of room modeling thing. It is also possible to bypass this completely. So I think a lot of people who have their own preferred way of handling ambience will want to use this setting in the advanced settings. Sounds like this, just with one Divisi section. With the room modeling, it sounds like this. So you can hear it's doing a lot to smooth out the sound there, whereas it's a much drier sound, and, to me, a slightly more exciting sound with it off. You do start to get this metallic sound, especially in the short notes, and that's even with the room modeling on. It's one of the things these modeled instruments so far, the sample modeling strings and this one as well, unfortunately, they're just not great at those spiccatos yet, or those short notes. Admittedly, it improves a bit when you start to multiply the number of instruments. If I add the room back in, you can do something fairly passable, but again, this isn't anywhere near as good as using, say, a spiccato patch or a shorts patch from Cinematic Studio Strings or one of those more traditional libraries. But yeah, that's just happens to be one of the weaknesses of this approach so far. Just to finish off with the room page, you get access to the level of absorption, which I've currently got set to high, but basically this controls how much early reflections you get, basically, and then the room size as well. And then if I set the absorption to low, just as a side note, one of the key things about this instrument, I think, is because it's modelling a real violin, it's quite important that you pay attention to bowing as you're inputting the notes. If you try and play this instrument like most other string libraries and just play legato on the keyboard, you get an okay sound, but it depends on the context, right? They might play it all on a single bow like that, but it's probably more likely that they would play détaché by default. Or perhaps a combination. My approach is to just do everything détaché, and the way that that's achieved is by pressing the sustain pedal down and then having a little bit of space between the notes, so you're not legatoing with your fingers. Versus, basically, if you play everything slurred in a melody line, it's going to start to sound pretty weird. So ideally a combination of both, or sticking to détaché is usually the way to go for a more realistic sound, I find. Let's have a look at the viola. So this is just 5 violas that you're listening to. You have a really impressive dynamic range with these instruments. So I'm having to do a lot in order for them to sound musical. And I think that's something to really bear in mind when you watch other people use this, if you're on a bit of a YouTube hunt for examples of people using this instrument, and you're trying to determine whether or not to go for this SWAM strings thing. It takes quite a lot of time and practice. And I have a slight advantage in that I've used the SWAM solo strings a lot, and they operate in much the same way. But also I have an advantage in that I've been performing for a very long time and improvising for a very long time. And so all of that is really what's making this sound come alive. You know, again, you might argue it's not the most realistic sound, but what's hard to convey through the screen is the degree to which there's a match between what you're hearing and the sound that's in my head, just in terms of the shape and the flow of the musical phrases. Let's have a look at the cellos. So this is 5 cellos. So at these lower numbers of instruments, you start to hear some of the grit, which feels like it's missing when you start to stack them up. So again, I want to spend most of my time showing off the smaller numbers of instruments, just because I feel like that's the biggest selling point really of the library, is this more chamber sound. Yeah, so those short notes, not particularly pleasant. You can hear what it's trying to do at those higher dynamics, like it's trying to give you some of that kind of ringing and so on that you'd get from a real instrument, but it's just, there's something really artificial about it, so not a fan of that. But it's pretty capable at that kind of more lyrical stuff. And again, the joy is, because I'm not limited to any one articulation set with this patch, I can very easily construct phrases and riffs and patterns that involve a whole multitude of different lengths of short and long notes. It communicates something emotionally, and I think when I'm writing and I'm sketching, that's what I'm looking for, is just to get ideas down on the page, because pretty much everything is going to need refining. It's a bit sad, I guess, it's a bit tragic that probably I would have to replace all of that, using more conventional samples. If I were creating a string mock-up, I would probably have to just use that performance as my model and then try and match it with CSS or some other library in order to get that higher level of realism. However, I think, first of all, there's probably some benefit in layering that, maybe if it's a prominent line. And secondly, I think mocking up is generally easier when you have a lot of information to work with. The best mock-ups are created when there's an existing recording already there for you to model as you're mocking it up. And so I think that stage of the process, if you do treat it as a separate stage, could happen quite quickly, the mocking up, if you know exactly what you're aiming at in terms of the musical vibe. So again, what these allow me to do as a composer, and it's early days, I haven't been working with these for very long, but what I imagine I'll be using them for is just for quickly sketching out things like that, ideas like that, which it opens doors musically. As a side note, those trills, you really don't get any of that divergence between the parts that you'd expect in a real section of instruments. You expect trills to sound a lot more chaotic than that, but really this sounds like one instrument. And there's no trill key switch or anything that can model that more accurately, so you're kind of stuck with that. But the same goes with the tremolos. They sound okay, especially when you have multiple ones going. Like if you layer this, if we create a second divisi, we have to manually set the divisi number to prevent phasing, and then just make sure that they're positioned sensibly. Oops. If we then control both of them, You know, it's not bad. I think it's syncing the tremolos there for some reason. I'm not quite sure. I need to go menu diving. So you can see how much options you have, you know. It really is crazy. There is that opportunity to dial in exactly what you want. But again, bear in mind that, to me anyway, it's not the most realistic sound. So you can spend hours tweaking and fiddling with the finer details. But really, I think what this instrument is for is just for getting the ideas down so that you can then replace it with a live player or with a better quality sample. That would be my interpretation. Here we go. So there's a Hertz and sync. For some reason it was set to sync. It actually sounds a lot better, I think, than the violins. Let's just have a look at the violins tremolo. To me that sounded pretty mechanical. So right hand. It's set to. Is it set to sync by default maybe? So anyway, yeah, I mean, it's okay. It sounds a little choppy. I'd probably feel more comfortable using a recording of a tremolo in most situations. But what's nice is you do have that ability to control the tremolo speed. And again, this applies to everything, you know, every bow pressure, every harmonic, every string position. Even you can change the string position so it favors open strings or positions higher up the fingerboard. So if you imagine how many gigabytes of samples would be required to fulfill all of that on a conventional library, it gets quite dizzying. Just to say, I haven't got any of these going through any external effects. This is pretty much how they sound out the box, just using the inbuilt room modeling. Let's hear 10 double basses this time. So I've got 2 Divisis here. Let's just listen to them both. That sounds pretty strange. To me, those attacks don't sound right. Again, I think it's the lack of kind of chaos of all the sort of noises that you'd get in a natural recording. It feels very controlled or very artificial somehow, but it does well at the legato stuff. And also, you know, tonally, this feels good. Like, it feels nice and full, especially with the room. Let's actually take out the room and just hear the raw sound. It's quite exposing, and it definitely makes it sound a bit more artificial. I could imagine using that as a layer. Yeah, not convinced by those attacks at all, but, you know, it does a pretty decent job. And again, you know, we have all of the joys of being able to play multiple types of articulations just fluidly. One thing to note is that you'll see, even though the vibrato is going up to the maximum, I don't think there's any way of making it even stronger. I'll have a quick look, but from what I understand, yeah, so as far as I can tell, the maximum amount of vibrato is not very much. Now, it's partly, I guess, because when there's lots of people vibratoing, there's a whole section, you do get less of an overall sort of wobble to the sound. But I guess I would like it to have even more exaggerated vibrato in an ideal world. It's interesting, there is quite a lot of top end and air to the note, but there's something a bit wrong about it. You know, it really starts to show the kind of modelled nature of the instrument rather than the sort of more analogy sound of a conventional sample or a real instrument. So now let's just try a few combinations. So I'm going to use a piece of software called Divisimate to just muck around, hear a couple of them, you know, combined with each other. So I'm going to take this 5 violins Divisi and maybe a cello and just do a little duet. Let's see how that sounds. Let's transpose that so that it's an appropriate pitch. So I just realised we're still listening to the raw sound, I think. So let's give it a little bit of help. Not bad, not bad. Let's try something a bit more chordal. So let's do violas and bass. So just put in the name so I don't get confused. So we've got cello and bass in octaves, classic. Can extend this a little bit. Then I'll have so violin 1 and 2 on the same line, maybe on the first voice, and then violas on the second voice. See how that sounds? Oops, I need to do that. you are getting these odd portamento slides happening occasionally. You know, again, especially things like that, you'd expect just a little bit more fuzz, a little bit more chaos. A lot of what makes it engaging, I think, as you're hearing it now in this context, is not so much the sample, but what I'm putting into it. You know, how I'm shaping the sound and how that's combining with the melodic and harmonic ideas. So it's really one of those things that it is what you make of it. Let's try changing the voicing. So we've got maybe the violas doing the second voice of a 3-note chord, down an octave to the note that I'm playing on the keyboard, and then the third note of the chord being played by the violin. So you got what makes a huge difference is those transitions between vibrato and non-vibrato. I can do things like this. Ooh, slight glitch there. Oh, hello. Okay, let's try something else. it doesn't sound that great in unison, does it? But to be fair, I guess if I were on a mission to only use sample modeling, SWAM, well, that's a bit of a faux pas, audio modeling, SWAM strings on a project and nothing else, I would probably be making little adjustments to each of the instruments to make sure that they're not quite the same. Otherwise you get this what's sometimes called accordioning effect, where everything sounds a bit too perfectly in line with each other. The minute you start to have some harmony in there, you know, I think the ear starts to go with it a bit more. But when you hear those exposed octaves or unison, you know, it starts to sound pretty cheesy, but it's all about, I guess, using the right tools for the right situations. And as a live improv tool, this is definitely some of the most fun I've had improvising, you know, through Divisimate in this case, controlling multiple virtual instruments. Very quickly, I'll just briefly describe what's happening. Basically, each instrument track is being sent to a Divisimate port via the MIDI input setting in the inspector. So this is port 2. So that's showing up over here in port 2. These numbers here correspond to that. And then these 3 numbers refer to the number of notes in a chord voicing. So if I play 3-note voicings like this, then that's 1, 2, 3, and those are being distributed to the different channels, which then correspond to different instruments. So here I've got the 3-note chord being played by Violin 1, Violin 2, and Viola. And then in the left hand, I've got channels 4 and 5, both just going to this low region, which means a monophonic region of the keyboard I can use to play both of these instruments simultaneously. In octaves in this case, because I've put a transposer on there. Really fun bit of software, Divisimate. And so that's how that's all working. So now I've got Violin 1, Violin 2 in unison, Viola at the octave. I guess this would simulate what you'd get if you just literally copy-pasted the same MIDI information to multiple tracks. It might sound a bit like this. It just sounds very synth-like. But it is fun for coming up with ideas. So thanks for watching. That was a lot of noodling and hopefully not too much rambling, just to give you an idea of how the library sounds in the hands of me specifically, somebody with, I guess, improvisation experience, composing experience with string libraries, you know, going back 10 years or so. A lot of the thoughts are coming from the perspective of somebody thinking about how would I use this on jobs, and how would I use this if I was doing a sampled mock-up where the final piece was going to be mock-up strings, you know, sampled strings, but also thinking about what other role might a tool like this have in my own work and sort of music creation. And I think the biggest thing that comes from this session is just the ability to get kind of completely carried away in noodling and improvising and mucking around, experimenting with chords and melodies and phrases. It's a good sign. It's like when I went to choose my piano, my upright piano, I played on so many different instruments, and if when I sat down I immediately just came up with loads of ideas, that was usually a good sign that maybe that instrument was the right choice. Anyway, hope this was helpful to some of you or just entertaining, and yeah, let me know if you have any specific comments or questions about how the SWAM section strings work. I'd be happy to do my best to answer them if you're considering making what's a considerable investment of around 500 quid. Yeah, hope this was useful. Thanks very much for watching. See you on the next one.